The integumentary system is the system that is composed of your skin is the largest organ. So your skin, your hair, your nails, and accessory glands. The glands reside in your skin, and we'll talk about specific types of glands at the end of the lecture. So those are the main components. The skin is the largest organ in the body. It never stops growing. Throughout your whole life, your skin is growing and continually being shed and replaced. Your hair is derived from the epidermis. Our hair follicles dip down into the dermis. Our nails are also epidermal-derived structures. And then our accessory glands are going to be important for producing secretions. So if we look at different functions of the skin, it's got several. It helps with protection, it helps with body temperature regulation, it helps with sensation. So we'll talk about all the functions individually. First, we can say it helps with protection. And it's doing this by providing a chemical barrier. It acts as a physical barrier. And it also acts as a biological barrier. The skin as a chemical barrier it secretes different chemical products onto its surface that can act in an antimicrobial fashion. So like your sweat is high in urea and uric acid. So that helps because it makes it hard for microbes to grow on it. It also produces other antimicrobial proteins that I'm not going to test you on, but there's one called defensin, and it helps to kill bacteria. So your skin's covered in bacteria. So by having this chemical barrier, that can help to prevent bacterial replication. So this urea and uric acid in your sweat can also be called the acid mantle in your skin, and it's just helping to provide this chemical barrier so that it prevents bacterial replication. Or it inhibits it, I guess I should say. It doesn't totally prevent it, but it slows it down. The whole top layer of your epidermis is made of dead skin cells. And so those act as a physical barrier that help to prevent the entrance of foreign particles. Those cells are shed off on a regular basis, so that's going to help to prevent the entrance. So we can say that the dead cells on top or on our superficial surface are regularly sloughed off, which helps with preventing physical entrance. And then as a biological barrier, you have immune cells in your epidermis and some other immune cells in your dermis that are going to be able to gobble up anything foreign that might make it through those first couple layers. So we can say, and they're phagocytic specifically. So we'll say phagocytic cells in the dermis and epidermis gobble up foreign material. So again, for the function of protection, our skin is protecting us by providing a chemical barrier, which is primarily composed of this acidic sweat that inhibits bacterial replication. You do make some other things that inhibit bacterial replication, but I'm not going to test you on it. It acts as a physical barrier. Our dead cells on top are continually sloughed off and replaced, and that helps prevent physical entrance of materials. And then it acts as a biological barrier because our epidermis and our dermis both have phagocytic cells that gobble up foreign substances. The next important function is that our skin actually helps with body temperature regulation. And this is going to be due to the presence of sweat glands and blood vessels. So body temperature regulation is the next important function. And the effectors in the system would be sweat glands and blood vessels. So when you get hot, your sweat glands will turn on. So we'll say red is hot. And in the heat, your sweat glands turn on. And in the heat, your blood vessels dilate. And what this does is it brings hot blood away from your internal organs and brings it to the surface of your skin. And then when you sweat, you lose heat as evaporative cooling. So in the heat, ultimately by turning on your sweat glands and dilating your blood vessels, you're able to lose heat through evaporative cooling. So your skin helps with regulation when it's cold by turning on our sweat glands and dilating our blood vessels. By increasing the diameter of our blood vessels, you carry that hot blood away from your internal organs, bring it out to the surface, turn on those sweat glands, and we're able to lose heat through evaporative cooling. When it's cold, we can turn our sweat glands off. So in the cold, we turn our sweat glands off, and we constrict our blood vessels. So by making the blood vessel diameter more narrow, then we are going to pull all that warm blood into the internal organs. And another thing that happens, which isn't really part of the skin, but you start to shiver, and that produces heat. So when it's cold, we can turn off our sweat glands, we can constrict our blood vessels. That'll shunt all of that warm blood into our internal organs to protect our vital organs, because that's where it's more important that we stay warm. All right, a third important function of our skin is that it helps with what are called cutaneous sensations. And the skin is our first layer of contact with much of the external environment. So it contains many sensory receptors that are going to be able to detect different changes in the system. So we'll say that the skin contains sensory receptors. So in this example of heat, we have what are called thermoreceptors. And they detect changes in temperature. We've got both cold and hot thermoreceptors. They're different receptors. Some are sensitive to temperatures above body heat. Some are sensitive to temperatures below body heat. But they're thermoreceptors because they're detecting changes in temperature. So that would be one type of cutaneous sensation. Another type, a general class, we'll talk about all the specific types of receptors when we get to the nervous system. But for now, in general, you should know about the different sensory receptors that we have as general categories. So the next category are what we call mechanoreceptors. And these detect changes in physical variables, so stretch or vibration or light touch versus deep touch. So mechanoreceptors detect physical changes. And then the third general class of receptors that we have in the skin are what are called nociceptors. And the nociceptors detect painful stimuli. Pain is indicative that you're about to do tissue damage. So anytime you are about to damage tissue, you'll feel pain. And that's happening through nociceptors. It's happening because you get too hot. If you get too hot and you're burning yourself, you'll activate thermoreceptors and nociceptors. If you, are ripping your skin, you would first activate our stretch receptors or some mechanoreceptors, but then as soon as you reach the level of tissue damage, you're going to activate nociceptors. So nociceptors are indicating that there's damage in the system, and they help you. Generally what will happen when you activate a nociceptor is you'll activate a reflex pathway that's beyond your conscious control. So your body will just take over and move you away from the painful stimulus. So those are our general categories of cutaneous receptors. We'll talk about the specifics at the end of the semester, but this is another important function of the skin. It helps with picking up cutaneous sensations. Other important functions, the skin can help with metabolic functions. The one that we're mostly going to talk about is what it does with vitamin D. So calcium is a really important ion in your body, but it's really hard to absorb. So to absorb calcium, we have to have vitamin 3 either taken into our diet or activated by UV light in our skin. So the precursor to vitamin D synthesis is in your skin. It becomes active when UV radiation hits it. It goes to your kidney or your liver and gets converted to something else, finishes getting converted in your kidney, and then helps with this hormone to help with calcium digestion. We will talk about that negative feedback loop in great detail, either with the bones. We might start with the bones because it's going to help with calcium blood calcium homeostasis, but we will definitely talk about it next semester. So just to be aware that it's happening, it all starts in the skin. So we can say that the precursor to vitamin D3, which is needed for calcium absorption, is activated by UV in the skin, or also activated in the skin by UV radiation. So you have to get about 15 minutes exposure to your hands and your face 3 times a week to be able to make enough vitamin D to help with calcium absorption. If you don't, if you're always coated in sunscreen or you're always wearing big sun hats and covering up your skin, then you have to take in vitamin D3 through your diet. Vitamin D3 itself is not what's helping with calcium absorption. It gets converted twice, but we'll talk about that either later this semester or at the beginning of next semester. Any questions on that? The next important function of the skin is that it provides what we call a blood reservoir. So, because of all of these blood vessels in your skin, we can shunt blood to it. So at any given moment, it can hold about 5% of your blood. It doesn't have to, but it can. So we have a couple blood reservoirs in the body. The skin is not the biggest, but it can be used to hold 5% of your blood at a time. We can open up those blood vessels in your skin, shunt the blood there, and then it acts as a blood reservoir. Okay, then next it helps with excretion, which is removal of waste. And this again is because our sweat it does contain urea and uric acid, but we can also lose excess ions and things that we need. If you're high in iron, that would be one that you can excrete in your sweat. So we can also get rid of excess ions through our sweat. So if you're high in salt, you can excrete sodium in your sweat. That's why sweat kind of tastes salty. If you're high in iron, you can excrete that in your sweat. So it's going to help to remove any extra waste that maybe your kidneys aren't pulling all of it out, and then your sweat can help get rid of some of that stuff. All right, then next we need to talk about the structure of the skin. And the skin has 2 main layers, the epidermis and the dermis. Deep to both of those layers is a 3rd layer another layer called the subcutaneous layer. That's not actually part of the skin. We talk about it now because it doesn't have a system. That's really the only place to talk about it. So we'll talk about each of our layers of each of these layers in greater detail, but our most superficial layer is the epidermis, and this is epithelial tissue. Deep to the epidermis is the dermis. This is connective tissue. And then deep to the dermis, we have what we could call the hypodermis, or subcutaneous layer, which is not part of the skin. So our epidermis and our dermis are part of the integument. The hypodermis is not. I promise that says integument. So the epidermis and dermis make up the layers of your integument, and then deep to that we've got this layer, the hypodermis, which is, or also known as our subcutaneous layer. There's not really another place to talk about it, so we talk about it now. And the hypodermis is primarily composed of adipose tissue. There is some areolar tissue. So we'll say primarily adipose with some areolar. And the subcutaneous layer is going to really be important for attaching skin to underlying structures. Other functions of the subcutaneous layer, it's a high proportion of adipose tissue, so it helps with insulation, and it cushions. And then it can also act as an energy reserve. So when you're putting on weight and you're gaining fat, you're gaining that in your subcutaneous adipose tissue. So you're growing those adipocytes in the subcutaneous adipose tissue. So that's our hypodermis.
What's that word right here, right?
Integument. I promise it says integument. That's integument written in doctor writing.
That's actually better.
All right. Any questions about the hypodermis? Now we're going to talk about our epidermis. Our epidermis has 5 layers that were, well, 4 to 5 layers, depending on what skin you're looking at, that we're going to talk about. And it contains many different types of cells. Deep to that, we've got our dermis, which has 2 layers. We'll look at those in just a minute. So first, let's talk about the cells of the epidermis, and then we'll talk about what layers we find them in and what each of those layers look like. So the most abundant cells that we find in the epidermis are cells called keratinocytes. Oocyte always means cell of some type. So these are keratinocytes, which accumulate keratin, which is a waterproofing protein. So these cells in the lowest layer undergo mitosis to give rise to new, more and more keratinocytes. So we'll say these are our most abundant cells. They're mitotic in the basal layer. And they get this name keratinocytes because they accumulate keratin, which is a waterproofing protein. It also helps to give them some strength. So in the basal layer of your epidermis, these cells are undergoing mitosis repeatedly to give rise to new keratinocytes that are going to rise up through the different layers and die off. This most superficial layer of your epidermis is 20 to 30 layers of dead keratinocytes. So by the time they finish their journey, they completely die off. But they're the most abundant cell types throughout the epidermis. They start in our basal layer dividing and they're still alive, and the next layer they're going to accumulate or start linking up by desmosomes, they're still alive, and the next layer they accumulate keratin and start dying off, and then in the most superficial layer they're dead. So our keratinocytes are the most abundant cells, and they're really going to help with this waterproofing and giving the skin strength. Yeah?
So, if there's not many layers, say you exfoliate your skin really, how long does it take for the, is this like super fast and you always have that many layers, or?
You always have that many layers because these in the bottom layer, they're always undergoing mitosis. How quick that happens kind of depends on what is going on in your environment. So like if you're sitting out in the sun and get a sunburn, then you're going to make more, and we're going to talk about that in just a second, and start sloughing them off more, and that's a protective function. So it kind of depends on how quickly they're wearing off. So our next cells are cells called melanocytes. And melanocytes make the pigment melanin. So if we look at, we'll go ahead really quick and just kind of look. If we look at the layers of our epidermis, this bottom layer here is the mitotic layer that's continually undergoing mitosis. And cells are coming through these other layers and coming up to die off. If these cells down here are always undergoing mitosis, then that means their DNA is pretty exposed on a regular basis. It makes it pretty vulnerable because as part of mitosis, you have to replicate your DNA and divide. So that can be dangerous if we're out hanging out in the sun a lot. UV damage can cause, or UV rays can cause damage to your DNA, which can cause things like skin cancer. So these melanocytes are these cells that you see hanging out down here that add melanin to keratinocytes, and what that does is it darkens them. So if you are being bombarded by UV radiation, you will increase melanocyte activity, and they will just start adding melanin to all of the cells going by. Because if you can make the cells that are going up darker, then you can protect the underlying mitotic cells. So that's kind of the protective role of sunburn, is to try and protect those actively mitotic cells. So we can say that our melanocytes are making the pigment melanin, and they add to keratinocytes, and this can have a protective function because it can protect those underlying mitotic cells. So they will really increase their activity if you've got more exposure to UV radiation. They will just add melanin to everything going by, so that you start getting really dark, and that should protect those underlying mitotic cells, so that hopefully you don't get skin cancer.
What do you mean by, I don't understand, add to keratinocytes?
So they have these extensions that they stick out, and they deposit melanin in keratinocytes. So keratinocytes of their own accord aren't making melanin,
Oh, okay.
but they accumulate the pigment as our melanocytes add it to it. All right, next we've got cells called dendritic cells. And dendritic cells are actively phagocytic cells that provide really the only direct immunity in the epidermis, because the epidermis doesn't have a blood supply. So our dendritic cells are providing the only direct local immunity for the epidermis. So I'm just going to say our dendritic cells are our phagocytic cells, and these are providing immunity to the epidermis. The last type of cell we find in the epidermis is what we call a tactile cell, or a Merkel cell, you might see them called. And these sense light touch. They're hooked right up to a sensory neuron and are going to sense light touch. And that's because they're directly in contact with the sensory neuron. Okay, then next let's talk about the layers of the epidermis. So we'll start with the deepest layer of the epidermis, what's called the stratum basale. Basale sounds like basal, so this is our basal, which is our deepest layer. And in this layer, this is where we have our actively mitotic keratinocytes. In this layer, we also have melanocytes. And we also have our tactile cells. So this is just a single layer of cells that contains these actively mitotic keratinocytes, melanocytes, and tactile cells. Superficial to the stratum basale, we have a layer called the stratum spinosum, or the spiny layer. And this layer looks spiny because our keratinocytes are starting to link up by desmosomes. They're snapping together, and you can see that in the preserved tissue slice. So we'll say it gets the spiny appearance because the keratinocytes are linking up by desmosomes. Melanocytes reach their hand, like these little feet up into the stratum spinosum and continue to add melanin to keratinocytes in that layer. So the melanocytes are still having their presence there because they have these long extensions that can reach up into there. So we'll say melanocytes are still adding melanin. Oh, I'll say they're still active in this layer. And this layer contains dendritic cells. And the stratum spinosum is several cell layers thick. So superficial to our stratum basale, we have the stratum spinosum, which is a spiny layer. It gets a spiny appearance because our keratinocytes are starting to link up using desmosomes. When you stain the tissue then, you can see that. So it looks spiny. The melanocytes are still active in this layer. And we've got dendritic cells in this layer helping with our immunity. And the stratum spinosum is several cell layers thick. Okay? Superficial to our stratum spinosum, we have the stratum granulosum. which is like our grainy layer. And in this layer, we have 4 to 6 cell layers. And in the deeper levels, our cells are still alive. But as they reach the more superficial levels, they're dying off and accumulating keratin. So that's what gives them the grainy appearance. As they start dying and accumulating keratin, they look grainy. So we'll say cells in lower layers are still alive. But they die off as they reach superficial layers. So it gets the grainy appearance because the cells are accumulating keratin. Our next stratum is only found in thick skin. Thick skin is only found on the soles of your feet and the palms of your hand. This is also called hairless skin. And this stratum is called the stratum lucidum. So we'll say only in thick skin. This is hairless skin. And this is only found on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Stratum lucidum, when you look at it under a microscope, it looks clear. And that's because it has a lot of this protein called the ledin. And the ledin does not pick up dye, but what it does is give extra UV protection to that skin. So it looks clear due to accumulation of the ledin. And what this is a protein that gives extra UV protection. This might be why you want to look at your skin slides today, because you can look at thick skin versus thin skin. And in thick skin, you can see this stratum. And you can see it because it doesn't pick up dye, so it's very clear and clearly easy to see. All right, the last layer of our epidermis, the most superficial layer of our epidermis, is what's called the stratum corneum. And this is 20 to 30 layers of dead cells, of dead keratinocytes, that are continually being sloughed off and replaced. So as you scratch, you're scratching off dead cells. As you pull on your tight jeans, you're pulling off dead cells. So these layers are continually replaced by the underlying layers. That's why that deepest layer is always undergoing mitosis. So that we're always making new cells to put through the layers, kill off, and give this protection to our top layer. So again, this picture kind of shows you, this is showing thin skin. And so we can see our stratum basale is this deepest layer where we've got our keratinocytes readily undergoing mitosis. This is also where we'll find our tactile cells and our melanocytes. Our stratum spinosum is several layers thick, and you can see it kind of looks spiny. This isn't the darkest picture here, but the cells start linking up by desmosomes, giving it that spiny appearance. And the stratum granulosum kind of has this grainy appearance. And the lower levels, our cells are still living. They're accumulating the keratin protein and dying off as we reach the superficial layers. And then our stratum corneum is 20 to 30 layers of dead keratinocytes that are continually being sloughed off and replaced. Questions on the epidermis? Yeah.
So does stratum just mean layer?
Yeah, pretty much. Yep. All right. So all 5 layers are up here in the epidermis. Then we've got our dermis deep to that. The dermis is very thick, and it has 2 layers of connective tissue. So one thing you're going to see as we move through anatomy and physiology together is that things that are shaped like this are called papilla. And so if you look, the first layer of our dermis has these papilla that poke up into the epidermis. So this layer is our papillary layer because it's got a bunch of papilla. So this is our dermis, and it's got 2 layers. The first layer is the papillary layer. relative to our reticular layer, it's this superficial layer of areolar connective tissue. And it's going to anchor our epidermis to the dermis. So those papilla stick up into your epidermis and anchor it. They hold it there. That's what gives you like your fingerprints. They're actually called friction ridges. And so if you look over any part of your skin, you've got markings. Those are friction ridges, and they're caused by the dermal papilla poking up into the epidermis. So this papillary layer is this areolar connective tissue that's anchoring our epidermis to the dermis, and it's the papilla that are doing this anchoring. And we'll say they cause what are called friction ridges. And that's allowing these two tissues to be held together and act as a cohesive unit. So all of these papilla are giving you your skin markings, like these little fine lines that you see, as they hold this dermis to the epidermis. Most of your dermis is what's called the reticular layer. It makes up about 80% of your dermis, and it's dense, irregular connective tissue. So our reticular layer is bringing in our blood vessels that are coming up to our papillary layer and branching so that they can serve the epidermis. So we can say for our reticular layer, it brings in blood vessels that branch. And then what we can say about our papillary layer is that it contains the branches that serve the epidermis. So the reticular layer is this dense irregular connective tissue that is, and remember, dense irregular connective tissue resists stretch in multiple directions. So it's important to have that in your skin because your skin is exposed to all kinds of tension from various directions. Other things that we can say about the reticular layer is that it contains the sensory nerve endings, our sensory receptors that are going to be hooked up to sensory nerves. So it also contains sensory receptors. Our glands, which are arising, they're originating from epithelial tissue poked down into it, and our hair follicles. So we can say it also contains our epidermal-derived structures. What are these? These are things like hair follicles and glands. All right, so we talked about our dermis. Here's our epidermis up here. This is actually a sweat gland pore, which is pretty neat. Then we can see here's our papillary layer that has these papilla sticking up into the epidermis. So these little shaped things are papilla, and this is that areolar connective tissue that has small branches of blood vessels that serve the overlying epidermis. And then here's our reticular layer, which you can see that dense, irregular, like we've got that irregular arrangement of our collagen fibers, but it's dense, irregular connective tissue that is really helping to give like the structure and support to most of the skin. As far as skin color goes, skin color arises from the interaction of three different pigments, primarily melanin. And melanin can range in color from like an orangish brown to a very dark brown, and so it's going to be the primary factor that determines your skin tone, and it's genetically determined. And the activity and number of melanocytes that you have are what is genetically determined. So this is what is going to determine how dark your skin gets, is how many melanocytes you have and how active they are. And so if you have genetic predisposition, and it can range in tone anywhere from like reddish, yellow, to brownish black. So melanin has quite a range of tone, and that again is going to be what is the primary determinant of skin tone. There are two other pigments that can have an effect. The second is called carotene, and this is actually found in your diet in foods called carotenoids, like carrots or sweet potatoes that have high levels of orange. So this is an orange pigment. found in plants. So if you don't eat a lot of orange plants, carotene is going to have very little effect on your skin tone. It tends to accumulate in your stratum corneum, and we can say especially in thick skin. The last pigment we find in your red blood cells called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the oxygen-carrying molecule in red blood cells, and so this is a pinkish hue. And you tend to see this more in people who have low levels of melanin. So in fair-skinned people who have low melanocyte levels and low melanocyte activity, they can have a nice rosy hue because you're seeing the effect of the red in their blood. So this is a pinkish hue that we could say is stronger in fair-skinned individuals who have low numbers and activity of melanocytes. So melanin, produced by our melanocytes, has the biggest effect on skin color. So if you've got a lot of melanocytes, it'll mask, and producing a lot of melanin, it will mask the effects of carotene and hemoglobin. If you have low levels of melanocytes, so low levels of melanin in your skin, then you tend to be fair, have much lighter skin tone, and we can see the effect of hemoglobin in your blood much more. So that's why fair-skinned individuals tend to kind of look pink. They also burn very easily. All right, so the last thing we'll talk about before break is hair. And hair is found all over your body. We've got two types of hair we'll talk about in a second. But the functions of hair are, first, it actually helps with protection. So the thin hair that you have all over your whole body protects you from insects. They should alert you when insects land on you. Every hair has a nerve, a little sensory receptor hooked to it, so it can feel if something lands on you. So for our first function, we'll say protection. And what can it protect us from? It can protect us from insects. So if an insect lands on your hair, you should feel it, and then you can like whack it away. Another thing, so that's the thin hair all over most of your body. Another thing that your hair can help with is the hair on your scalp can actually help protect you from physical trauma. So scalp hair is going to protect from physical trauma. Another thing that scalp hair protects you from is heat loss. Most of your heat is lost out of your head. So if you've got a nice thick head of scalp hair, it can prevent heat loss. And then the last thing that your scalp hair and your eyebrows actually help with is protecting you from UV radiation or from UV exposure. So hair is found everywhere except for the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, your lips, and your nipples. Some parts of external genitalia, but most of it has some hair, some terminal hair. As far as the structure of the hair goes, your book goes into great detail about the structure of hair. I'm not really concerned about that. You should just know in general that the part above your epidermis or leaving your epidermis is the shaft. And our root is found in what's called a hair follicle. And hair follicles are important because they're going to contain a couple of these accessory structures of the skin. So, are we good on protection functions? So just in general, be aware that the part of your hair that's above your epidermis is your shaft, what's below the epidermis is your root, and the root is found in a hair follicle. So a hair follicle is important because it's got structures that are these accessory structures of the epidermis. So our root, we'll say, is found in a hair follicle. And for structure of a follicle, I do want you to know general parts of the structure of a follicle. So if this is our hair root, what you can see about the follicle is that it's actually easier to see in our picture over here. So if you look at a hair follicle, It is an epidermal-derived structure that pokes down into the dermis. And so that stratum basale with those living cells is going to poke down into the dermis, and it actually overtakes a dermal papilla. And we then call that a hair papilla. And what you can see is that we've got branches of blood vessels in it that are serving that living hair. So that the hair follicle has these living layers that are derived from that stratum basale, and that's what these keratinocytes are going to undergo mitosis here and then die off to become part of the hair. So the hair is primarily formed of keratinocytes, and the hair follicle has these important structures. So you can see here what we call a hair papilla, and that basically is a dermal papilla that was overtaken by the hair follicle. And what else we can say about this hair papilla is that it contains blood supply, or blood vessels that supply the hair. Other things that are associated with hair follicles that aren't imaged on this picture of it, but you can see on the other picture of it, is every hair follicle has a little muscle associated with it. So this is a muscle, and it's called an erector pili muscle. And what it does is it stands your hair on end. When you get cold, or when you get frightened, the erector pili muscle contracts and it stands your hair on end. This is not so important in humans, but think about cats. Like, you have a little cat and it gets scared, and it puffs up. That puffing up is a function of those erector pili. As it gets frightened, those hairs stand on end and it makes it look bigger, so that maybe it can look more intimidating to whatever it was that frightened it. So that's not so important in us, but it is important in some animals. The other thing that we will see associated with every hair gland, or every hair follicle, is a gland called a sebaceous gland. We're going to talk more about sebaceous glands after our break, but what these do is they produce a fluid called sebum, and what sebum does is makes your hair soft and pliable. Two types of hair, what's called vellus hair. Vellus hair is a thin, fine hair that's found all over the body of children and adults in some regions, but before puberty it's found all over the place on kids. So this is our soft, fine hair that covers most of the body. And our other type of hair is called terminal hair. Before puberty, everybody has it on their scalp and eyebrows. After puberty, you still have it on your scalp and eyebrows, but then you start growing it in other places. So this is for scalp and eyebrows, it's for everyone, kids and adults alike. And then after puberty, it starts growing in your axillary and pubic regions. So nails are epidermal-derived structures, and they are going to help with functioning for protection. We don't use that a lot, but other animals like cats and things do. So nails help with protection and being defensive protection. And then they also function for the manipulation of objects. So we do use that function. So if you have small objects that you're trying to grab, then you can use your nails kind of to help with that. You can look over this figure in your book, but again, I'm not going to test you on the structure. Just be aware that it is, again, derived from the epidermis and pokes down into the dermis. The last thing that we have to talk about for Chapter 5 is glands, or our different types of glands. So the first category, the general category of gland, are what we call sudoriferous glands. I have all these silly poems and things and remember stuff. And this is the one my daughter hates the most. And I say you can remember sudoriferous glands or sweat glands because sudoriferous sounds like odoriferous. I don't know. So odoriferous is, sudoriferous. Our sudoriferous glands are all sweat glands. And the first type of sweat gland that you have all over your body, with the exception of like your nipples and your lips, are exocrine sweat glands, is their name. They're the way that they release their sweat is through merocrine release, which again is by producing it and releasing it through exocytosis. So these are the most abundant, and they're found all over your skin. So I'll say they're found throughout most of the integument. And the sweat that they produce is that really watery sweat that's rich in those wastes and ions. So our first type of sudoriferous gland is the exocrine gland. It's the most abundant sweat gland. It's found all over your body, and it produces a watery sweat that is rich in wastes and ions. These are going to be the sweat glands that have the biggest effect on temperature regulation. So when you turn on sweat glands to help with temperature, it's your exocrine sweat glands that are doing that. So these really help with temperature regulation. The next type of sweat gland is what's called an apocrine sweat gland. It's called apocrine, and its method of release is apocrine. So our second type of sudoriferous gland is apocrine, and that's both in name and method of release. And these are confined to the axillary and pubic regions, and they become active at puberty. The sweat that they release is rich in proteins and fatty substances. So on its own, it doesn't have a scent, but the bacteria on your skin start eating up those proteins, and they make the scent. So the sweat is rich in proteins and fatty substances. So we'll say on its own, it's odorless, but bacteria eat it. And then the stuff that they're secreting as waste and things is what starts to make it smelly. So these sweat glands can be important for communicating long distance chemical messages. So you can do pheromonal signaling, which works from like one human to another. Pheromones are excreted from apocrine sweat glands, and other things called allelomones, which affect different species, are also secreted through apocrine sweat glands. So they say dogs and bees smell fear. That's because of the apocrine sweat that you're making. So those chemical signals are these proteins and fatty substances that make it all delicious and delightful for bacteria. Yeah. So in this schematic here, you can see an exocrine sweat gland. They have these big long ducts that dump onto the epithelial surface. So that is what makes it an exocrine gland, is that it releases its product into the duct. You can see the secretory cells here. And then its duct is winding up through the dermis and is going to dump onto the epithelial surface. So there are other types of apocrine glands by method of release. So apocrine glands in name and method of release are these sudoriferous glands that are confined to your axillary and pubic regions. These other apocrine glands are not sudoriferous glands. They're modified sudoriferous glands, or modified sweat glands, so we just call them other apocrine glands. And the first kind are what are called ceruminous glands. And ceruminous glands are found in your ear where they secrete cerumen. And what cerumen is it's a waxy substance that is kind of bitter, and it helps to prevent like bugs going in your ear and hanging out and enjoying it. So that earwax, what we commonly call earwax, is actually cerumen, and it's a waxy substance. It's a waxy, bitter substance. And the idea of having these ceruminous glands in your ears, if something crawls in there, it should be pretty sticky and pretty bitter in there, and they want to crawl back out. So it's kind of protective. And our other type of apocrine gland, our last type, are what are called mammary glands. Mammary glands are found in mammary tissue in the breast, and they produce milk and release it under two different hormonal influence. So they're found in mammary tissue. Then our last type of gland is the sebaceous gland. I briefly talked about this when we talked about hair follicles. Sebaceous glands are the glands that you find in hair follicles where they secrete sebum. And sebum is this kind of nice oily substance that is going to lubricate your hair as it's growing out so that it becomes soft and pliable. And this is the glands by method of release are holocrine. So our sebaceous glands are holocrine, meaning that they accumulate sebum, and then the cell disintegrates and releases it into the duct. So they produce sebum, and sebum is kind of this oily secretion that is going to lubricate the hair as it's growing past to make it soft and pliable. But if you imagine a hair follicle that has a sebaceous gland attached to it, that is a structure that's like leading deep into your skin. It goes into your dermis. So frequently you'll find like a bacteria will hop onto a hair, crawl down, get into that follicle, eat that sebum, and feel like they're having a great time in there. So then your immune system has to be called to the area, and these cells called neutrophils will go gobble it up. They make up the major component of pus. So if you've ever had a big nasty zit, we all have, what it is all these bacteria that they hitchhiked a ride down that hair, went in there and ate all this sebum, and then because that hair has blood supply in that hair papilla, your white blood cells can get out there and fight it. So the major component of pimples is pus that's coming from these cells you have called neutrophils gobbling up bacteria that are eating this stuff up. So it's quite tasty, the little bacteria. It's like a free ride into your body, down that hair, and now they've got a food supply.